James Harper eased the car into the driveway, cutting the engine and leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "Well," he said, glancing at his wife Emily in the passenger seat, "we're home." Emily smiled as she looked at the house before them, its white shutters glowing softly in the late afternoon sun. It was everything they had dreamed of, a colonial-style gem tucked away in the storybook village of Willow Creek. The house had stood for nearly 2 centuries, its time-worn bricks and sloping roof whispering tales of lives once lived. To Emily, it felt alive, warm and inviting, as though it had been waiting just for them. Their 3 children tumbled out of the back seat, their laughter breaking the stillness of the sleepy village. The youngest, Lily, raced toward the backyard as her older brothers followed, their shouts of discovery echoing around the property. "Mom! Dad! You've got to see this!" Emily and James exchanged a grin and joined their children. They stepped into a backyard unlike any they had seen before. A canopy of ancient oaks framed the space, dappling the ground with shifting patches of sunlight. But what truly caught their attention were the carvings. The wooden figures stood scattered across the yard, weathered and smooth from decades, or perhaps centuries, of wind and rain. Each one was unique. A solemn-faced angel, a twisted vine intertwined with small woodland creatures, a knight poised mid-stride with his sword raised. The largest piece, set near the back of the yard, depicted a towering stag with antlers that seemed to claw at the sky. "They're magnificent," Emily breathed, her fingers brushing the worn surface of a nearby carving. It was a small cherub with its head tilted upward, as if caught mid-prayer. "Imagine the history here, James. How many people must have stood right where we are now, admiring these? Or ignoring them while they mowed the lawn," James replied with a smirk, though he had to admit the carvings held a strange sort of allure. "It's like having our own outdoor museum." Lily tugged at Emily's hand. "They're kind of creepy," she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of awe and unease. "It feels like they're watching us." Emily laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "They're just statues, sweetheart. Nothing to be afraid of." But as she spoke, her gaze lingered on the stag. Its dark, hollow eyes seemed almost too lifelike, the sharp angles of its face casting long shadows in the fading sunlight. James clapped his hands together, breaking the moment. "All right, team, let's get unpacked before it gets dark. We've got plenty of time to explore tomorrow." As the family headed inside, the backyard seemed to exhale, its stillness resettling like an undisturbed pond. The carvings stood motionless, their gazes fixed, silent sentinels keeping watch over the Harpers' new home. It was a house filled with promise, dreams, and a fresh start. But beneath its charm, something ancient and restless stirred, waiting patiently for the Harper family to notice. The first time James noticed it, he didn't say anything. It had been a long day at work, and the last thing he wanted was to start imagining problems. But as he stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing his coffee mug, his eyes fell on the backyard. Something was off. The wooden cherub, the one Emily had admired on their first day, was facing a different direction. He was sure of it. Its small, weathered face, which had once gazed upward toward the oaks, now pointed directly at the garden path. James frowned, wiping his hands on a towel. "Hey, Em," he called, leaning into the living room where Emily sat reading. "Did you move one of the carvings? The cherub by the patio?" Emily looked up, puzzled. "Move it? No. Why would I do that?" James shrugged it off. "Must be my imagination." He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of memory, but a small, nagging doubt lingered as he returned to his routine. The next morning, the doubt grew. This time, it wasn't just the cherub. The solemn angel, once perched near the shed, now stood at the edge of the lawn, her gaze tilted toward the house. The knight, with his raised sword, had shifted ever so slightly, angling toward the back porch. "Emily," James said more urgently that evening, pointing out the changes. "Something's going on here. The carvings, they're moving." Emily chuckled, though her eyes flitted nervously between the figures. "You've been working too hard, James. Maybe you're just remembering wrong. Besides, who would move them? They're practically cemented in place." James wanted to argue, to insist that he wasn't imagining things, but he let it go. Still, he found himself watching the yard more often, his unease growing with each passing day. It was Lily who voiced what he had been thinking all along. "Daddy," she whispered one evening as they stood by the window. "I don't like them. They're getting closer." James crouched down, pulling her into a hug. "They're just old statues, sweetheart. Nothing scary about them." But his words felt hollow even as he said them. A week later, Emily's scream shattered the calm of a lazy Sunday morning. James rushed outside to find her standing frozen in the garden, her face pale. "They're all facing the house," she said, her voice trembling. James looked around and felt his stomach drop. Every single carving, every cherub, angel, knight, and the towering stag had turned. Their weathered faces now stared directly at the back of the house, their expressions seeming sharper, almost accusatory. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind, maybe a prank, but no explanation felt right. That night, neither James nor Emily slept well. Every creak of the house made James flinch. Every shadow cast by the moonlight seemed to shift. And then the final straw came. It was Emily who discovered it first, the next morning as she went to water the plants. She called for James, her voice shaking with something between anger and fear. "James, come here, now." He hurried to the garden shed and stopped short. Scrawled in crude black paint across the wooden panels were 3 words: "You don't belong." The letters dripped like fresh blood, the words slashing across the once pristine surface with violent finality. James's fists clenched at his sides as a chill ran down his spine. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the silent carvings, standing as they always had, their gazes now impossibly heavy. Emily reached for his arm. "We need to call the police," she said firmly. James nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. Whoever, or whatever, had left that message didn't just want them gone. It wanted them afraid. The night the Harpers' world truly unraveled began like any other. The children were tucked into bed, their soft breaths filling the upstairs hall. James sat in the living room, absently flipping through channels, while Emily read, curled under a throw blanket. It was nearly midnight when James decided to lock up. As he crossed the darkened kitchen, he glanced out the window at the backyard, a habit born of unease. He froze. In the pale glow of the moonlight, shadows danced beneath the sprawling oak tree at the far end of the yard. No, not shadows. People. "Emily," he called, his voice a strained whisper. She hurried to his side, and together they stared out into the night. A group of figures, 6 or 7, moved in a slow, deliberate circle around the base of the oak. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, as if guided by an unseen force. They wore masks, plain, white, featureless masks that glinted eerily in the moonlight. Cloaked in dark, tattered robes, the figures swayed and spun with a disturbing grace, their heads tilted toward the sky. The large wooden stag carving loomed nearby, its shadow merging with the figures as if it were part of the ritual. What are they doing?" Emily whispered, clutching James's arm. "I don't know," James replied, his voice tight with dread. One of the figures broke from the circle and reached toward the oak's trunk, placing both hands against its rough bark. As if on cue, the others stopped and turned their heads, their blank masks facing the house. James felt his breath catch. He wasn't imagining it. Their attention was fixed on him. "I'm going out there," he said, stepping back from the window. "Are you insane?" Emily grabbed his wrist, her grip fierce. "You don't know who they are or what they want." "That's exactly why I need to go. I'm not going to let them terrorize us." Ignoring her protests, James grabbed the heavy flashlight from the counter and unlocked the back door. The cool night air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside, his heart pounding. "Hey!" he called, his voice breaking the unnatural silence. "What do you think you're doing?" The figures didn't respond. They stood motionless, their masked faces tilted toward him. James's grip tightened on the flashlight. He took another step forward, emboldened by anger. "I said, what are you doing on my property?" One of the figures tilted its head slowly, the movement almost curious. Then, as if commanded by an unseen voice, they all began to move again, not toward him but around the tree, faster this time. Their circle tightened, the air around them seeming to hum with an unnatural energy. "Get out of here!" James shouted, his voice cracking as fear began to creep into his chest. Still, they ignored him. James took another step, his free hand reaching for the phone in his pocket. But before he could call for help, one of the figures stopped, then another. One by one, they turned to face him, their masks gleaming like pale moons. James felt his resolve falter. There were too many of them, and something about the way they stood, unmoving and silent, sent a primal chill racing down his spine. "James, come back inside!" Emily's voice, desperate and trembling, cut through the night. He took a step back, then another. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The figures began to advance, their steps deliberate, almost predatory. James turned and bolted toward the house, his breath ragged as he stumbled up the porch steps. He slammed the door behind him, locking it with trembling hands. "They're coming," he managed to choke out. Emily pulled him away from the door, her face pale. Together, they backed into the living room, staring at the windows as shadows flitted past. But the figures never tried to enter. They lingered, their movements slow and deliberate, until they faded back into the darkness of the yard. For hours, James and Emily sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Neither dared to sleep, knowing that whatever had come for them was far from finished. The eerie quiet that followed the installation of the security cameras did little to ease the Harper family's anxiety. James had hoped that catching the intruders on tape would offer some sort of explanation, but as days passed with no new incidents, the unease only deepened. The cameras, which now covered every corner of the yard, remained motionless, recording nothing but the quiet sway of the trees and the occasional flicker of moonlight. Yet, every time James passed the window or stepped into the backyard, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Something just out of sight, hiding in the shadows cast by the ancient oaks. The carvings, once strange but harmless, now seemed to carry a weight of silent judgment, their hollow eyes perpetually following his every movement. He often caught himself glancing over his shoulder as he moved about the house, the sensation of unseen eyes pressing in on him growing more palpable with each passing day. One evening, weeks after the strange figures had vanished, Emily approached James in the living room, her expression tight with something between fear and exhaustion. "James, I found something," she said, her voice low, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile quiet of the house. "What is it?" James asked, pushing himself up from his seat. His heart raced with the knowledge that something else was amiss. Emily handed him a weathered notebook she had found tucked away in a drawer of the old study desk in the attic. The pages, yellowed and fragile, were filled with uneven handwriting, some of it faded as though written long ago. The text was erratic, almost frantic, but the most disturbing part was the recurring mention of the carvings, of the watchers in the yard, and an ancient warning. They stand silent, but they are never still. They watch the living, waiting for them to join. James flipped through the pages, the words feeling like a heavy weight pressing against his chest. Some of the entries were too faint to read clearly, but the message was unmistakable. Those who lived at Willow Creek were not the first to fall victim to the figures in the yard. The book described the previous owners of the house, families who had come and gone over the years, each one driven to madness, each one eventually disappearing without a trace. The final entry, dated nearly 50 years ago, was written in a hurried, spidery script. "They've come again. The carvings move. I hear them in the night. The masks, the watchers. We're next. We." The rest of the sentence was illegible, smeared with what appeared to be ink or perhaps something darker. James closed the book with a soft thud, his mind racing. "We need to leave," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of finality. Emily nodded, her face pale. "I think you're right. But where can we go? It feels like we're trapped here. Like something's never going to let us go." They knew, in their hearts, that leaving wouldn't solve anything. Something about the house, the carvings, and the presence in the yard had marked them. They would never truly be free. And so the Harpers began preparing for the inevitable. They packed what little they could, as quickly as possible. But no matter how fast they moved, the house seemed to stretch the moments, dragging them deeper into its silent grip. The statues were still there, watching, their faces frozen in eternal observation, as if waiting for the final piece to fall into place. On the night they finally left, the house stood quiet, almost expectant. The last thing James saw as they drove away was the towering stag, its dark eyes gleaming under the moonlight. its antlers still clawing at the sky. And somewhere in the distance, beneath the ancient oak trees, the figures stirred once again. The woods of Cascade Falls stretched out like a sea of evergreens, their towering forms standing sentinel over the land. In the heart of this remote wilderness, nestled against the edge of a quiet river, stood the Bennett's cabin, a striking contrast to its surroundings. A sleek, modern structure of steel and glass, its clean lines and minimalist design seemed almost out of place among the ancient trees that had stood for centuries. Noah and Sophia Bennett, a young couple with a passion for technology, had chosen the cabin as a retreat from their fast-paced city life. Noah, a software developer with a knack for solving any technical issue, had spent the past few weeks outfitting the cabin with smart devices. Sophia, an architect, reveled in the tranquility of their new home, using the space as an escape to recharge and focus on her latest design projects. Max, their golden retriever, had taken to the wilderness like a fish to water. The vast forests and winding trails provided endless adventures, though lately his behavior had become more erratic. Unexplained growls and nervous glances that made the couple exchange concerned looks. But Noah, always the rational thinker, chalked it up to Max adjusting to the new environment. One afternoon, while working on the cabin's electrical system, Noah found himself kneeling on the cold concrete floor of the basement. The wiring for the lights had been faulty since they moved in, and he was determined to finally fix it. With the soft hum of the electrical panel and the steady rhythm of his tools in the background, Noah lost himself in the task. That was when he noticed it. A steel trapdoor, almost hidden beneath a thick layer of dust and old wood panels. He paused, his hand lingering over the wires. There had never been mention of a basement door when they first toured the cabin. No blueprints, no previous owners hinting at its existence, just this heavy, rusted door. Curiosity piqued, he cleared away the debris. The metal door stood cold and unyielding, its edges worn with age. There was no lock, just a faint outline of a handle, as if it had been opened long ago, then forgotten. He frowned, running his fingers along the edges. No markings, no indication of its purpose. Max's growl echoed from the top of the stairs. Noah looked up. The dog stood rigid, his golden fur bristling, eyes fixed on the trapdoor. His tail was tucked low, ears pressed back in discomfort. "Max, what's wrong, buddy?" Noah called out, but Max didn't move. Instead, the dog's low growl deepened, an unsettling vibration in the air. Noah's brow furrowed. He didn't believe in coincidences, and he didn't believe in superstition, but something about this trapdoor, it felt wrong. There was something here that he couldn't place. Sophia appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her jeans, a concerned look on her face. "What's going on with Max?" Noah hesitated, glancing at the trapdoor and then back at her. "I don't know. I just found this under the stairs. There's a door here. Looks like it's been here for years." Sophia crossed the room, her footsteps light but her eyes sharp. She crouched next to him, looking down at the door. "That's strange. I've never seen it before." Max, still frozen in place, refused to take his eyes off the door. "Well, it could just be an old storage room," Noah said, trying to dismiss the feeling that was beginning to creep over him. "I'll get a locksmith, see what's inside." Sophia nodded, though she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. Something was off. She could feel it too, in the air, in the tension that hung in the space between them. As Noah stood to make the call, Max's growl intensified, almost as if in warning. Something was waiting beneath the surface of their peaceful cabin. Something that had been buried long before they ever arrived. The next morning, Noah and Sophia sat in the small dining area of the cabin, the air thick with tension. Max, unusually quiet, lay curled in his bed by the window, his eyes darting around the room. Noah had placed a call to the cabin's previous owner, a man named Richard Hale, and though the line had been disconnected several times before Richard finally answered, his voice sounded distant, as though it was a conversation he'd rather avoid. Noah had asked about the trapdoor. Richard's response had been quick, almost rehearsed. "Oh, that old thing," he'd said. "It leads to a storage room. Nothing special, just some leftover stuff from the previous tenants. No need to worry about it." But Noah could sense the hesitation in the man's voice, the way he tripped over words, as if trying to keep the conversation as brief as possible. The explanation felt too convenient, too vague. Sophia had overheard Noah's side of the conversation and, without saying much, had given him a look. They both knew something wasn't right. "Let's just get a locksmith," Noah said finally, setting the phone down with a sigh. "We need to know what's down there." The locksmith arrived mid-afternoon, a wiry man named Greg who worked out of a nearby town. His smile was thin, his movements efficient but calculated. As he knelt by the trapdoor, he barely exchanged a word with the Bennetts, as though he had unlocked doors like this for years, though he was undoubtedly curious about the secrecy surrounding the place. His tools clicked against the old metal, a sharp, steady rhythm that added to the rising unease in the room. Max didn't like Greg. He growled low as the locksmith worked, pacing back and forth, his hackles raised. "You all right there, boy?" Greg muttered, giving the dog a side-eye as the last bolt clicked free. With a grunt, he lifted the trapdoor, revealing a narrow, descending staircase, the air that leaked from the depths of the hidden room cold and stale, like something long undisturbed. Noah exchanged a glance with Sophia. She took a slow breath and nodded. "After you," she said, her voice steady but betraying an underlying uncertainty. Noah went first, carefully stepping down into the darkness. The moment his foot landed on the cold concrete below, a sharp odor hit him. A musty mix of old paper and something else, something faintly metallic that made his stomach twist. He turned back to Sophia, motioning for her to come down. The room was small, claustrophobic. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with dust. Candles, long burned down to nothing but stubs, littered the floor and the shelves, their wax melted in odd, grotesque patterns. But it was the drawings that caught their attention first. Sophia stepped closer to one of the walls, her fingers brushing over the brittle pages of a large journal that lay open on the floor. The pages were covered with hurried, almost frantic sketches, figures with strange elongated limbs, faces contorted in fear, twisted shapes that seemed to move on their own when she dared to look away. The illustrations were interspersed with notes written in a hurried, almost unreadable scrawl. "Noah, look at this," she whispered. He crossed the room, his eyes scanning the pages she held out to him. The sketches were disturbing, the faces too real, too human, but not quite. There was something unnatural about the way they were drawn, a twisted sense of familiarity that made his skin crawl. In one corner of a page, a symbol was scrawled over and over, like it was meant to be a warning. "What is this?" Sophia muttered. Her voice shook, and for the first time since they had moved in, she felt the cold weight of fear pressing down on her chest. "It looks like drawings of people," Noah said slowly. "But not real people, almost like something's watching them." The room felt even colder now. Max's whine from above ground echoed through the trapdoor, though he did not dare descend to the basement. The air was thick with unease, a feeling of being far too exposed in a place meant to be hidden. Noah carefully placed the journal back on the shelf, his gaze moving across the rest of the room. His eyes settled on something else, a series of small, intricate carvings etched into the wood of the walls, barely visible beneath the layers of dust. Symbols. Lines and spirals that formed patterns he couldn't quite decipher, but there was a familiar, unsettling quality to them. Sophia took a step back, her eyes darting to the far corner of the room. There, in the dim light, lay another journal, this one slightly more worn than the others. She reached for it, her fingers brushing across its surface. As she opened it, a chill ran through her. The pages were filled with the same cryptic drawings, but the language in the writing was different, almost impossible to read. There were dates, names, and strange words, some of which she swore she recognized from the back of her mind. It was as if she had seen them before, somewhere, somehow. "Noah." Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the page in front of her. He moved toward her, his own heart racing as he scanned the unfamiliar words. Something about them felt wrong. He could almost hear the voices in his head, an echo of something that didn't belong, something ancient. Before he could speak, there was a soft noise from the corner of the room. A creaking, a soft scraping sound. Noah's head snapped to the side, his breath catching in his throat. The air seemed to shift, thickening around them. "I don't think we should be here." Sophia said, her voice tight with fear. But before Noah could respond, something caught his eye, something that was now unmistakable. The candles. They weren't just remnants of the past, they were fresh. Wax had dripped onto the floor in patterns that didn't fit the passage of time. The scent of burning had lingered. Someone had been here recently. Someone had been watching them. That night, the weight of the discovery hung heavily in the cabin. The air outside was still, the dense forest around them pressing in like a watchful presence. The couple tried to shake off the creeping unease that had settled in their bones, but every shadow felt sharper, every creak of the cabin's timbers louder. Sophia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, unable to rid herself of the strange drawings, the cryptic journals, the ominous feeling that something was just beyond reach. Waiting. Watching. Noah, too, lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through the events of the day. What was it about the drawings that unsettled him so deeply? They had been only the beginning. There had been the strange carvings on the walls, the faint scent of fresh candle wax, the eerie stillness in the room when they had discovered the hidden journal. All of it pointed to something older. Something sinister beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful life in the woods. At some point in the night, a sound pierced the silence, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A scraping, like something moving along the walls of the cabin. Noah's heart skipped a beat, and he sat up abruptly, his eyes darting toward the dark window. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Sophia nodded, her face pale in the dim moonlight. She had heard it too. Without a word, they both got out of bed, silently moving toward the trapdoor in the living room. The heavy silence was suffocating as they descended into the hidden room once more, the faint smell of old paper and damp wood lingering in the air. This time, Noah's eyes didn't linger on the journals or the unsettling drawings. He was searching for something else, something that had been gnawing at the back of his mind since they had first discovered the room. He moved to the far corner, where the dirt floor was disturbed, footprints, faint but fresh, leading toward a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest. But Noah knew better now. He reached out, brushing his fingers over the uneven surface, tracing the lines of the wall as though he could feel something hidden beneath it. His fingertips grazed a cold metal edge, thin, hidden, and nearly invisible. He pressed harder, and the wall gave way with a low creak. The earth trembled slightly beneath his feet, as if something was waking from a long, slumbering stillness. With a final push, the wall swung open, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended into the ground, the air from below colder than the rest of the room, as though it carried with it the chill of the earth itself. The passage was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, the edges jagged and rough. Sophia gasped, stepping back, her pulse quickening. "Noah." Her voice trembled. "What is this? Where does it lead?" He didn't answer immediately, his face pale as he gazed into the dark opening, a new sense of dread growing within him. He could feel it now, the same feeling that had been gnawing at them all evening. The knowledge that they were no longer alone, that something had been waiting for them in the shadows. But they had come this far. There was no turning back. They squeezed through the narrow tunnel, the walls pressing in on either side, the darkness almost suffocating. As they reached the end, the tunnel opened out into a small clearing at the edge of the forest. The trees towered above them, the thick canopy blocking out most of the moonlight. Max stood at the edge of the clearing, his ears perked, his body tense. His eyes glowed in the dark, focused on something deeper in the woods. He growled low, his tail held stiffly behind him. Noah and Sophia moved forward cautiously, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. They could feel it, the oppressive presence that had been following them since their arrival, the feeling that something was not right in the woods surrounding them. As they ventured deeper into the forest, their path became increasingly erratic, as though they were being led somewhere. And then they saw it. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree was a symbol, just like the ones in the journals. The same spirals, the same lines that seemed to shift and distort in the darkness. It was too familiar, too intentional. Max's growl turned into a snarl as he stepped back, eyes wide, his fur bristling. They could hear the unmistakable sound of something moving behind them, too close for comfort, too deliberate to be just the wind. Noah turned, but there was nothing there, only the whisper of leaves in the wind, the oppressive silence pressing in on them. "What the hell is happening?" Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. They kept moving, unable to stop now, drawn by an invisible force. Every step brought them closer to something old and buried, something that had been here long before they had arrived. The forest felt different now. No longer the peaceful sanctuary they had imagined, but something darker. Something that had been waiting for them, and that would not let them leave. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the ground shifted beneath their feet, the soil unnervingly soft. Another carving, another symbol, this one larger, more intricate than the others. It pulsed with a strange energy, as if the forest itself was alive, watching them. Max was on edge now, his growls turning into frantic barks, his body taut with fear. Noah felt a cold chill creeping up his spine, and as he turned to face Sophia, the words came unbidden. "We need to go back, now." But it was already too late. The air shifted again, and they both turned, hearing the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the distance, too deliberate, too close. The forest seemed to close in around them, the path home no longer visible, the shadows lengthening, stretching as though they had a life of their own. And that's when they saw it. A figure, tall, hooded, and cloaked in darkness, emerged from the shadows. Its face was hidden, its presence overwhelming, a wave of malevolent energy that sent a shiver down their spines. Noah and Sophia froze, unable to move, the crushing reality settling in around them. They had wandered too far, uncovered something ancient, and now they were trapped, caught in the pull of whatever watched them from the depths of the forest. Max's growl turned into a low whine, his body trembling as the figure took a step toward them. The following morning, the forest seemed as peaceful as it had been when Noah and Sophia first arrived, untouched, serene, and blanketed by the soft golden light of dawn. But the weight of what they had seen, what they had felt, lingered in the pit of their stomachs. Their footsteps through the dense underbrush felt heavier, the air more oppressive, as if the very earth beneath them was holding its breath. Max had refused to leave the cabin all night. He stayed by the door, his body taut with unease, his eyes flickering toward the woods whenever the wind stirred the trees. The couple had tried to shake off the sense of dread that followed them, but every glance toward the darkened forest only brought a fresh wave of apprehension. When they had finally gathered the courage to leave the safety of the cabin, they did what they knew they had to do: call for help. The sheriff's department was the first to arrive, led by Deputy Harris, a seasoned officer with a skeptical demeanor. He listened to their story with a mixture of patience and disbelief, his eyes narrowing as they recounted every detail: the trapdoor, the hidden room, the tunnel leading to the forest, the strange symbols carved into the trees. He took notes, nodding occasionally, but there was a subtle cynicism in his gaze, as if he believed them to be overactive imaginations stirred by too many hours in isolation. Sophia couldn't blame him. She wasn't sure she believed it herself. The search through the forest yielded nothing. There were no signs of footprints, no disturbances in the soil where the tunnel had opened into the clearing. The carvings on the trees, though undeniable in their eerie symmetry, were dismissed as the work of local vandals. The deputy assured them it was all just a coincidence, another mystery of the woods. The sheriff's team combed the area for hours, but when the sun began to dip low in the sky, they returned empty-handed. No trace of the figure that had stood in the clearing, no evidence of anything unusual, just trees and silence. "We'll keep an eye out," Deputy Harris said, his voice firm, yet laced with an undertone of uncertainty. "But you're safe. You've got no reason to worry." But the words felt hollow. Noah and Sophia didn't know if they were safe. They didn't know if they'd ever been safe. Days passed, and the cabin became a place of suffocating stillness. The rooms, once welcoming, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind brushing against the walls, sent their nerves on edge. The forest, which had once been a backdrop to their idyllic retreat, now loomed over them, dark and oppressive, like an uninvited guest lurking just beyond the windows. The drawings in the journals, the carvings on the trees, the figure they had seen in the clearing, these things stayed with them, even though they tried to push them out of their minds. They tried to focus on the mundane, the routine of everyday life. But no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, the memory of that night remained, a shadow clinging to them, seeping into their every thought. Sophia found herself staring out the cabin window at the line of trees, her gaze distant, searching. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting, watching from the darkness. Noah, too, found it harder to sleep, his thoughts consumed by the figure in the woods. The oppressive quiet outside was maddening, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the wrong move. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, they sat together in silence, the faint hum of the cabin's lights the only sound. Max lay at their feet, his eyes half closed, but even he seemed restless, his ears flicking at every whisper of sound. "Do you think we imagined it?" Sophia asked softly, her voice breaking the quiet. Noah didn't answer immediately. He had asked himself the same question countless times. But even if it was a trick of the mind, there was no denying the feeling that clung to them, like a chill that never left. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "But whatever it was, it's not gone, it's still here, in the woods, watching." Sophia looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Do you think we should leave?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Noah didn't answer right away. The thought of leaving the cabin, of abandoning their dream of peace and quiet in the woods, felt almost like defeat. But the pull of something dark, something unseen, weighed heavier on his heart with every passing day. "I don't know," he repeated, "but I don't think we can ever really leave it behind." And so they stayed. The cabin became their prison, the forest their watchful jailer. The memories of what they had uncovered, the hidden room, the tunnel, the figure in the woods, remained at the forefront of their minds. But they said nothing more about it. The sheriff's department had closed their case, chalking it up to a mix of local myths, an overactive imagination, and the isolation that had begun to fray their nerves. For all their efforts, they had found no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. The trapdoor was locked again, the journals put away, the mysterious carvings dismissed as simple vandalism. But Noah and Sophia knew better. They knew that some things were left uncovered for a reason. In the silence of their cabin, in the oppressive watchfulness of the forest, they remained on edge, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The woods of Cascade Falls had always been quiet, always been still, but now it felt as though the trees themselves were watching them, waiting for them to make the next move, and so they waited too. Lucas Rivera had imagined this moment countless times. Standing in front of the house he could finally call his own, feeling the weight of responsibility mixed with the thrill of independence. At 28, it was the first time he'd truly settled down, purchasing a small, cozy bungalow on Elm Street. The street was lined with aging trees whose branches bowed low, as though they were guardians of the quiet neighborhood. The houses here were modest, brick-and-mortar sentinels, most of them worn by time but full of character, their weathered facades echoing stories of years gone by. His own bungalow, though charming, was no exception. With its steep roofline, white shutters, and ivy creeping up the stone exterior, it had a quiet charm that whispered of simpler times. The small front porch where Lucas stood now felt like a threshold to something new, something real. There were no grand expectations, no daunting ambitions. It was just him, the house, and the promise of a fresh start. Yet, as he surveyed the small yard, a subtle shift in the air made him pause. Something had caught his attention. In the yard of the house next door, a figure stood unmoving. She was an elderly woman, stooped and frail, her greying hair a wild mass that had long since escaped any attempt at taming. Mrs. Harlow, as he had been told when he signed the papers, was the reclusive neighbour who had lived in the house next door for years. The house itself was a dilapidated relic, its once white paint now chipped and faded, the windows obscured by an overgrowth of ivy that had all but swallowed the structure. It was the sort of house people whispered about, forgotten by time, left alone in the shadow of the well-maintained homes that surrounded it. But it was Mrs. Harlow's behaviour that unsettled him. She was standing in her yard, watching him, silent, unmoving, like a sentinel from another era. Her gaze was fixed on him, piercing, yet devoid of any warmth. He couldn't recall a time when she'd spoken to him, but then again she rarely came outside. It wasn't just the oddness of her presence that bothered him, it was the stillness, the unsettling quiet of her stare. She looked almost as if she were waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. Lucas shook off the unease creeping up his spine, telling himself it was nothing. After all, she was just a neighbor, a part of the landscape now. But as he turned to head back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching him. Her eyes, though hidden in shadow, seemed to follow him as he moved. It was the beginning of something. Lucas wasn't sure what yet, but he felt it in his bones. Something about Elm Street, about Mrs. Harlow and her unblinking gaze, felt like the start of a story he had no control over. Days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling into his new home, but the presence of Mrs. Harlow remained a constant in the back of Lucas's mind. At first, it was easy enough to ignore. After all, she was just a reclusive neighbor. But it was the way she lingered in her yard that gnawed at him, the way her eyes never seemed to leave his house, even when the sun dipped below the horizon. She would appear at odd hours, as though summoned by the very act of his presence in the neighborhood, standing there, silent and still, her gaze locked unwaveringly on the windows of his bungalow. Each time Lucas noticed her, it was as though time itself had frozen in place. The air grew thick with an unspoken tension, and though she never spoke, her silent observation felt more like an accusation. Lucas told himself it was nothing, just an odd neighbor who had perhaps grown accustomed to watching the world pass by from her overgrown yard. But the unease never left him. One evening, after returning from a long day of teaching, Lucas stepped onto his front porch to find something that shouldn't have been there. A small wooden doll sat squarely in the center of the welcome mat, its dark eyes staring up at him. It was crudely carved, its features exaggerated in a grotesque way, a misshapen face, its lips twisted in an eerie grin. The doll seemed so out of place, so carefully placed, as if someone had thought of nothing else but where it would go. He picked it up cautiously, his fingers cold as they brushed against the splintered wood. It was lighter than it looked, as if it had been carved from the remnants of something older. Something warm. He turned it over, his breath catching as he noticed that the doll's back was marked with strange, jagged symbols scrawled deep into the wood. They looked ancient, unfamiliar, as though they had been etched in haste and desperation. Lucas stood frozen on his porch for several moments, staring at the doll as if waiting for it to move on its own. When nothing happened, he slipped it into his pocket, his mind racing with questions. Had it come from Mrs. Harlow? Was it some kind of twisted welcome gift? He tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than a childish prank, a harmless gesture from a neighbor who didn't quite know how to connect. But that night, as the darkness of the world outside crept further into the corners of his house, Lucas was jolted awake by a sound that he had come to dread without even knowing why. The sharp ring of the doorbell. His heart leapt into his throat, and for a moment he couldn't move. It was late, far too late for a normal visitor, especially on a weeknight. He shuffled to the door, his pulse quickening with each step. When he opened it, there was no one there. Just the cold night air and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. But as his eyes scanned the darkened porch, he saw something else. A shadow. There, standing at the edge of the yard, was Mrs. Harlow. She was back, her frail figure half shrouded in the dim light from the street lamp, her face just visible in the shadows, her eyes locked on his. Lucas's breath caught in his chest. She hadn't moved, not an inch, just staring. It was then that he realized she wasn't just standing there, she was waiting for him. He slammed the door shut, his pulse racing, a cold sweat creeping down his spine. It was as though her stare had followed him inside, lingering in the corners of the room, a constant, oppressive weight pressing in on him. The ringing of the doorbell came again the next night, and again the night after that. Each time, Lucas answered to find no one there, only the quiet emptiness of the night and the feeling that Mrs. Harlow was watching him from the darkened yard, her eyes never wavering from his house. The presence of the doll on his porch, the ringing at all hours, and Mrs. Harlow's relentless vigil all blended together into something darker, something that felt far less innocent than it had before. The house, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a prison, one that was closing in around him, trapping him with no escape. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself that it was all just a coincidence, but the nagging feeling remained. Mrs. Harlowe's gaze felt suffocating. It followed him, always lingering in the corners of his vision, as though she were a part of the very air he breathed. And still, each time he answered the door, he found no trace of her, only the lingering, bone-chilling sense that something was coming. Something that would finally explain why she was here, why she had chosen him. It happened on a night when the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the street, as though even the heavens themselves had grown wary. Lucas had locked all the doors and windows, double-checked them with a compulsive precision. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different, that something was about to break, and whatever it wasn't going to be something he could walk away from. He had just settled into bed when the ringing of the doorbell shattered the silence. At first, his heart didn't skip a beat. He had grown used to it, the unnerving sound that seemed to carry with it a shadow all its own. But tonight, something was different. The bell wasn't just a late-night nuisance. It was a summons. Rising from his bed, Lucas didn't hesitate. His breath was shallow, his limbs stiff with tension as he moved through the darkened house. The door was already ajar, a sliver of light spilling from the living room onto the porch. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen anyone on the security camera. But Mrs. Harlowe was there, standing just beyond the door, her figure trembling as if it had been pulled together from the shadows themselves. Her eyes were wide and wild, as though no longer anchored in reality, her frail hands clutching something, a jagged shard of glass. Before Lucas could speak, before he could even react, she lunged. The sharp edge of the glass slashed through the air, slicing open the thin fabric of his sleep shirt. Pain shot through his chest like a spark to dry tinder. He stumbled back, gasping, blood staining the fabric in an instant. Mrs. Harlowe's eyes burned with a frenzied madness, her voice raspy as she screamed, "You did this! You took her from me!" His mind scrambled, his pulse pounding in his ears, but the words didn't make sense. He wasn't the one who had taken her daughter. He didn't even know her daughter. But the rage in Mrs. Harlowe's eyes was undeniable, and the glass in her hand, gleaming and deadly, was enough to make him question everything. The air between them grew thick, suffocating with her fury. "You think you're safe here, in your little house?" she hissed, the words drenched in years of loss. "She was my everything, and you took her. You took my child." Lucas's chest heaved, the shock of the attack giving way to adrenaline. He couldn't reason with her, couldn't reach her through the haze of madness clouding her mind. The shard of glass hovered in the air between them, ready to strike again. His instincts kicked in before his thoughts could catch up, and with a force born of pure survival, he grabbed her wrist, twisting it until the shard slipped from her grasp. She screamed, a primal sound that echoed through the house. In the chaos, Lucas shoved her backward, his hands shaking as he caught a glimpse of the terror in her eyes. She was wild, desperate, as if she were fighting for something more than her life, fighting for a memory that had long since slipped away. "I didn't," Lucas began, but his words were drowned by her frenzied sobs. She collapsed to her knees, her body racked with a grief so deep it seemed to consume her whole. Her breath came in harsh, broken sobs as she rocked back and forth. The dangerous edge of the glass had vanished, but the madness still clung to her, a dark shadow in her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The house was silent, except for the rasp of Mrs. Harlowe's breath. Lucas, still reeling from the attack, kept his distance, his mind racing to piece together what had just happened. He could hear sirens in the distance now, growing louder with each passing second. He didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, seconds, an eternity, but the authorities were coming. As he stepped away from her, Mrs. Harlowe's gaze snapped to his, sharp and unblinking, like a predator suddenly realizing it had been cornered. She didn't speak, but in the silence her expression told him everything. She had lost. And somewhere deep within the labyrinth of her fractured mind, she knew it. Lucas backed toward the door, his hands still trembling as he fumbled for his phone. The 911 call felt surreal, as if he was speaking to someone else, relaying a story that didn't quite belong to him. "I need help. My neighbor, she attacked me. She's out of her mind. Please hurry." The words were strained, but they came out clear enough, and within moments the sirens were right outside. By the time the authorities arrived, Mrs. Harlow had crumpled to the floor in a heap, her body still, her breathing shallow. The glass shard lay forgotten beside her, a silent testament to the violence that had just erupted in the quiet of the night. The officers moved in cautiously, their faces set with the grim resolve of those who had seen too much. They took Mrs. Harlow away, their hands gentle but firm as they guided her toward the waiting ambulance. Her eyes never left Lucas, though she no longer seemed to recognize him. She was a hollow shell, a woman lost to her grief, to a madness that had festered in the dark corners of her mind for too long. As the ambulance pulled away, Lucas stood on the porch, his body still trembling with the aftermath of what had happened. His chest ached with the weight of it all, the pain, the fear, the confusion. But above all, there was the suffocating sense that the peace he had hoped for had already slipped through his fingers, like sand. He glanced back toward Mrs. Harlow's house, now silent and still, the shadows cast long across the yard. He didn't know what had happened to her daughter. He didn't know why it had to be him, why the dark history of that house had to spill into his life. But what he did know was that something in that house, something in Mrs. Harlow's broken heart, had never truly let go, and neither would he. The days that followed were a blur. Mrs. Harlow was swiftly taken into custody, her fragile mind no longer able to cling to the threads of reality that had once defined her existence. The officers had been kind, but there was a quiet horror in the way they handled her, a knowing that spoke volumes about the depth of her unraveling. The ambulance whisked her away to a psychiatric facility, a place where the remnants of her broken mind would be confined to sterile walls, far removed from the house on Elm Street. Lucas, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of his life. The house, once a dream come true, now felt like a prison, a silent witness to the madness that had unfolded just beyond its walls. Each room seemed to echo with the ghost of Mrs. Harlow's presence, the remnants of her grief still lingering in the corners, like cobwebs that refused to be brushed away. He tried, at first, to push through the discomfort, to shake off the unease that clung to him like a second skin. But the feeling persisted, an oppressive weight on his chest, a reminder that the house had never truly been his own. It was as if he were living in someone else's memory, walking through a dream that had long since turned into a nightmare. He went to work each day, numbly greeting his students, his colleagues, as if nothing had changed. But when he returned home, the sense of isolation settled in, thicker than ever. The house, with its creaky floors and flickering lights, became a place of refuge for a man who no longer felt at peace in his own skin. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the quiet, once so soothing, was now unbearable, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The nights were the worst. He would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the nagging thoughts that spiraled in his mind. The images of Mrs. Harlow's crazed eyes, her hollow gaze as she was led away, haunted him. What had driven her to this point? What terrible grief had warped her into something unrecognizable? And more troubling still, what had she seen in him, in his presence, that had sparked her fury? In time, he began to notice things he hadn't before, the way the shadows stretched unnaturally at night, the occasional flicker of movement just out of the corner of his eye. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make his heart race, enough to make him question his own sanity. There were days when he wondered if the house, in all its quiet, unsettling beauty, had become a part of him, a place where the past refused to stay buried. Then came the moment of clarity, sharp and undeniable. Lucas had been sitting in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, when the realization hit him. He was suffocating. The house wasn't just a place where he lived. It was a reminder of something darker, something he couldn't escape. Mrs. Harlow's madness wasn't just a fluke. It was a sign, a warning that the house held more than just memories. It held something far more sinister. Without hesitation, Lucas made the decision. The house would be sold. The dream he had built for himself, the one he had poured his hopes and future into, would be let go of. And just like that, the weight on his chest lifted, as if the very act of making the choice had freed him from the grip of his own doubts. The process was swift. A few months later, the house was sold to another young couple, eager to begin their own life on Elm Street. Lucas watched them from the window, standing on the porch with hopeful smiles, unaware of the history that lingered just beneath the surface. He didn't pity them. He didn't warn them. He simply walked away. The day he left was a quiet one. He didn't feel the satisfaction of a victory, nor the relief of a burden lifted. It was as though the house had already let go of him long before he made the choice to leave. His belongings were packed into a small van, his life now confined to the back of a truck. He took one last look at the bungalow, its faded charm now a distant memory. It was over. But as the car pulled away from Elm Street, as the house receded into the distance, a strange sense of closure settled over him. He was free, in a way he hadn't been for months, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the weight of the past fall away. Yet, even as he drove away, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Something had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The house on Elm Street remained empty now, but its shadows, those shadows that had once reached out to claim him, lingered, ever present, in the corners of his mind. The memory of Mrs. Harlow, her eyes wide and accusing, haunted him in the quiet moments when the world around him was still. And though he would never return to that place, he knew it would never truly let him go. And so with each passing day, the house on Elm Street faded into the background of his life, a haunting reminder of the past. But Lucas never forgot. Some things, he learned, could never truly be erased.